Okay, so last time we looked at the performance of the Action 5 Pro, the Action 6 and the Ace Pro 2 in a daylight setting in both front lit and backlit scenarios, and we looked at how detail was handled and how well they graded. But today I want to look at low light performance. Now, there's a lot of talk about these cameras and how they perform in low light and compare with each other. So I wanted to go out and test all the different settings and different shutter combinations and find out what exactly is going on. Why are there the differences between the cameras, and can they be made more even? Is it just a case that one camera is better than the others in the low light situations, or is it down to the behavior of that camera, how it's programmed to behave compared with the other cameras? So I'm going to show you a montage of shots in the night modes on the camera. Now, I've dialed down the sharpness in some of the shots on the Ace Pro 2, setting it to the low setting because I wanted to see what that looked like, but everything else on the cameras is left at the factory default. So this is what you get out of the camera, and then we'll go through the different settings as the video goes along. So yeah, it's a long video, so let's just get to it. Okay, so you've just looked at an initial montage of some low light level shots that I took in the lovely town of Bridgnorth. I'm going to be looking more detail in some other aspects of the image when it's used in faster moving situations a bit later on. But for now, let's just focus on these street sequences. Now, one of the things you will have noticed right away is that the Action 5 Pro has some pretty poor stabilisation. There's a lot of motion blur, you know, and as I've said in previous videos, I've checked, triple checked and quadruple checked my settings to make sure there's nothing funny going on and that, you know, I'm using some kind of slower shutter or something, and I'm not. It's all set up correctly. But as you can see, there is a lot of jitter and motion blur going on in the background, so the stabilisation isn't very good. By contrast, the Action 6 has much better stabilisation. There is still some jitter and motion blur going on in the background there, but it is a vast improvement over the Action 5 in the Super Night mode stabilisation. It's pardon the pun, night and day. It is much better. There is still some jitter, as I say, but it is a vastly improved situation over the Action 5. But I think that is because the Action 6 is using the f2.0 aperture. I fixed it at f2 on these examples here, and it is therefore using a faster shutter speed than the Action 6. The grey area, or the spanner in the works, is the fact that if we look at the Ace Pro 2, it's getting very similar exposure levels to the Action 6. Now, the Ace Pro 2 has an f2.6 lens, which is slightly faster than the f2.8 of the Action 5. But if we look at the imagery, it's getting very similar exposure levels, and at the same time, it's getting much better stabilisation. The stabilisation on the Ace Pro 2 in the pure video mode is absolutely rock solid. There's pretty much no jitter or motion blur going on there at all. And if we look at the waveforms, that's the Ace Pro 2, and that's the Action 6, and that's the Action 5, or slightly different situations. But for the most part, the exposure levels on these is pretty similar. A lot of this is going to be down to the fact that the Super Night modes and pure video modes are down to a lot of processing. That is what they do. So they can bring the gain up to quite high degrees, and they perform a lot of noise reduction and other stuff that processes the image that gives you a usable image in the end. So that does go a long way to explaining why the Ace Pro 2 manages to get similar exposure levels despite having a slower lens than the Action 6. Now, the big question is, why can it get much better stabilisation? I'm not entirely sure why this is. Is the Ace Pro 2 prioritising a faster shutter speed over the initial exposure and then doing much more complicated processing to bring that exposure back up? That's a possibility. And the reason I say that is that in a later test when I do the running, you'll see what happens when I put the Ace Pro 2 into the blur reduction mode compared with the sport stabilisation of the DJI cameras. So I think there's possibly something to it that the Ace Pro 2 is prioritising using a faster shutter speed, and it's doing a much bigger boost on the exposure on the image to bring it back up, and obviously very advanced noise reduction processing as well. And let's not forget that the Ace Pro 2 has two separate processors, and one of those processors is completely dedicated to image processing. So although the Action 5 and Action 6 both have a 4nm processor, it doesn't have multiple processors with one dedicated specifically to image processing. So the Ace Pro does have that advantage, and whether it's doing some kind of other blur reduction in real time somehow, I don't know, but the fact is that the Ace Pro probably has access to much more processing power when it comes to processing these low light images. In terms of things like facial detail, there's not a lot in it between the cameras other than the motion blur aspect. So I think certainly the Action 5 is showing its limitations. The stabilisation just isn't as good as the Action 6 and the Ace Pro. But in terms of how the actual image looked, to be perfectly honest, there's not a whole lot in it. Now, the Ace Pro 2 does have an advantage over the DJI cameras in that in pure video mode, you can set the sharpness down to low. Part of how these low light modes work is that they often produce a lot of edge enhancement, which can look very over processed and digital. Now, the Ace Pro 2 in this shot, I've set to the default sharpening setting, which is medium. But these other shots here, we've got this shot of a little street scene. You've got this wedding shop in shot there. Now, this is the Action 5, you've got the Action 6, and you've got the Ace Pro 2. Now, let's take a look a bit closer in. On the Action 5, we can see the dress is blown out here a fair bit, whereas the Action 6, there's a lot more detail on the interior of that shop, and I think you've got more texture here on the pavement here on the Action 6 versus the Action 5. And then the Ace Pro 2, and the Ace Pro 2 again has done a nice job here with rendering the inside of the wedding shop, and it's got nice detail here on the pavement and paving slabs here. Now, immediately you're going to notice that the Ace Pro 2 is a lot softer image, and that's because in this shot I've set the sharpening to low, and I've done a little bit of a sharpening addition here. So if I turn it on, that's what it's like off, on again. So it makes a big difference to be able to add that in. And this ability to bring the sharpening down shows its advantages in these paving slabs here. So if I play, say, Action 6, do you see the dot crawl going on here? It kind of presents itself as, it's really aliasing, I think, but it's but you can see the way it's moved, the texture's kind of moving about unnaturally. It's performing a lot of edge enhancement on this stuff, producing some aliasing effects depending on how it's processed. If we look at the Ace Pro 2, if we play that same section of pavement, you'll notice that it's just much smoother. There's none of that dot crawl or aliasing going on. And that's because I've been able to turn down that sharpening in camera to a minimum. So it's not creating those sorts of artifacts. So if I turn the sharpening on in my grade, just gives you that subtle boost of sharpness. And you can see there's a little tiny bit of that artifacting brought in there, just a bit, but it's far less than you get with the hard in-camera processing of the Action 6 and the Action 5, where they don't allow you to dial that sharpness down, and DJI should really take note of that. Now, this scene was a slightly odd one as well. So that's the Action 5 Pro. That's the Action 6. And we've got the Ace Pro 2. Now, in this instance, you see the Ace Pro 2 looks a lot darker in exposure than the Action 6 or the Action 5. And so this is why this is one of the reasons it's very, very difficult to compare these cameras in the low light mode in terms of their exposure level and what they're doing, because we don't know how that camera is prioritizing the exposure. Superficially, you could look at this and go, oh, but the Ace Pro 2 isn't doing such a good job in this low light situation. It's not as bright, but it's not really about how bright the exposure is as such. As we've seen in previous shots, the Ace Pro 2 can match the Action 6 and get better stabilisation. So I think, what we're seeing here is just a difference in how the camera is responding to and measuring exposure levels and what it thinks is a realistic exposure level. It's much darker, as you can see here in this area. And if I bring up the shadows, say, the details there, so you could bring that up if you wanted to. Looking at the detail, if we go pixel peeping, again, the Ace Pro 2 has that ability to dial down the sharpness, which I've done here. Apart from that sharpness aspect, I have to say there's not really a lot in this other than you get a little more motion blur and jitter on the Action 5 Pro, but generally here, I'm not really seeing anything that hugely stands out to me that puts one camera ahead of the other in terms of this type of shot. But as I say, when it comes to moving shots, things are slightly different. Now, here's a static shot. Again, it is on full auto, and this is where things get a lot muddier. So I did a shot here with the Action 6 fixed on f2.8 to see what it's like compared with the other cameras. You can see it's a bit darker than the other cameras. And this is it This is the Action 6 with the f2.0 setting, and as you can see, it's definitely brightened things up, but it's kind of brought it back to the same brightness as the Action 5. What's happening? Why is this happening? And again, it's not as straightforward as you might think, because you need to take into context the stabilisation, which I've still got turned on. And so the camera is very likely using a faster shutter speed. So you're getting a slight boost in the brightness while simultaneously being able to use a faster shutter speed. Whereas the Action 5, as we've seen from the walking shots, yes, it looks here like, oh great, it's the same exposure as the Action 6, therefore what advantage are you getting with the Action 6? But as we've seen from the walking shots, the Action 6 is using a faster shutter and is getting much better stabilisation. And this is kind of one reason why doing these static shots for this kind of testing doesn't really tell you a whole lot, because as I say, superficially you could look at this and look at the Action 6 in f2 mode and just conclude, well, the Action 5 is getting a similar exposure. But as I say, once you start moving, that's when things show themselves in terms of how the shutter is being used. But again, we look at the Ace Pro 2, and the Ace Pro 2 is brighter again. So again, what is going on here? If you look at the waveform here, if you look at where the darkest areas of the Action 6 shot are, and they're right slap bang against the 0. Okay, you can't get any lower than that. Whereas we look at the Ace Pro 2, and if you look at that, you'll see that shadow areas are slightly lifted compared to Action 6. And also, if you look at this area here, still the shadow areas, but yeah, this sort of more middle area of exposure is lower on the Action 6. So it appears like the Action 6 is crushing things a bit more. In some ways, it does kind of work a bit better. I think it looks a bit more defined on the Action 6, even though from a technical perspective, like if we zoom in to this house or building on the side of the river and we look at the Action 6, the Action 6 still has that detail there. I mean, if I turn this little rudimentary adjustment that I made, I can boost them up a little bit to be similar to the Ace Pro 2. There's not much in it really in terms of actual captured detail or in the shadows and stuff. There isn't a lot in it. And again, if you compare the two, just generally, I can't honestly say that one is standing out to me as being significantly better from the point of view of this static shot. You can look at the clouds here. There's not a lot in it. They're slightly different in the way they're reproducing things. Interestingly, the SuperNight mode files on the Action 6 are in fact 10-bit colour, but I don't think the advantages really show themselves as much in this kind of mode with the amount of processing and noise reduction that's going on as it does in the standard video recording modes. If we look at the bridge, I think maybe the bridge detail is a bit more defined. I've got the sharpening set here on the Ace Pro 2, so there is a little bit of sharpening being brought back in here on the Ace Pro 2. I think it's a little bit sharper, more defined on the Action 6, but to be honest, there's not a lot in this that I can see. But as I say, when it comes to evaluating this kind of stuff, the static shots like this don't really tell you a whole lot. It's when it's moving like this that the real differences become apparent. And in this test, the Ace Pro 2 most certainly has the best stabilisation and the most control over the image in a night mode, in that you can reduce that sharpness down and get a slightly less over-enhanced looking image that you can dial back in a bit later. So certainly in this particular instance, the Action 6 is a big improvement over the Action 5 in terms of stabilisation, but the Ace Pro 2 still pips the Action 6 to the finish line when it comes to the actual stabilisation of the image. So with that preliminary look out of the way, let's take a look at some running shots, much more motion in the image, and see how each of the cameras copes in that situation. Right, so here's where things get more interesting. So I tested the cameras in settings that would maximize the shutter speed. So in the case of the DJI cameras, that's the sport stabilisation mode, and that supposedly increases the shutter speed at the expense of a slightly lower exposure in order to be able to capture better stabilisation in these low light levels. On the Ace Pro 2, I set the stabilisation to high, and I also turned on the blur reduction option as well, which from its description is supposed to do the same thing as the sport stabilisation on the DJI cameras, i.e. it maximises shutter speed at the expense of exposure. But the two different makes of camera seem to have two very different approaches to things. First of all, we've got the Action 5 Pro, and as you saw in the montage, the stabilisation is not great. It's not as bad as it was in the daily stabilisation when I did the walking test the other night in Bridgnorth, but there's still quite a lot of jitter there and motion blur going on. Whereas on the Action 6, you can see it's much better. It has done a very good job of minimising the jitter. There is a very small amount there, but it's not even as bad as it was when I was walking through the town the other night when I had it on the daily stabilisation. So I think sports stabilisation seems to be the way to go for the DJI cameras. You've got the Ace Pro 2 here, which again is doing an absolutely superb job of keeping the image completely stable. It's doing an absolutely fantastic job of that, and I've got to hand it to Insta360 for the quality of that stabilisation and those light levels. But as I say, the Action 6 is doing a much better job here than it did the other night in the daily stabilisation, even though there's a lot more motion going on here. There are some little differences here and there, and again, the Insta360 seems to win out in this again. So if we take this segment here, look at the reflection of the headlight from the van, and look at this light here, this street lamp. So this is on the Action 6. Okay, so then we come to the Ace Pro. Difficult to get these cameras in exactly the same place. First of all, let's just look at the street lamp. You notice on the Action 6, it blew out quite a bit. It's handled much more gracefully on the Ace Pro 2, whereas the Action 6 seems to have a very hard exposure cut off compared with the Ace Pro. But if we look at the headlights here, I know this isn't the exact same frame, but it does it throughout the Action 6 shot. If you look at the reflection here, look at how much more gracefully the reflection is handled as well on the Ace Pro 2. You've got the road texture there. It's this nice orange colour, whereas on the Action 6, it's blown it out. It's a very harsh overexposure point there. On the waveform, although it's not showing it as a maximised exposure, it's clipping regardless of where it's showing on this waveform. It is a hard clip regardless. The Ace Pro 2 has come out on top here, and if we look at this grass texture on this segment of the run, you can see the texture of the grass, and it's a low light mode. It's never going to be absolutely perfect, but we can see lots of grass texture there on the Ace Pro 2. And if we go to, okay, you can see the grass texture there. And then if we go back on the Ace Pro 2, again, you've got lots of grass texture there. They're handled a bit differently. But on the Action 5 Pro, you can kind of see the texture of the grass, but it's kind of interspersed with that motion blur there, you see, from the jitter, because it just can't handle the stabilisation as well. Whereas the Action 6 and the Ace Pro 2 have handled that much, much better. Although the stabilisation here on the Action 6 is much closer to the performance of the Ace Pro 2. The Ace Pro 2 still just about beats it stabilisation wise, but it also is handling those extremes of lighting much more effectively on the Ace Pro 2 in this instance. It's a complete reverse of how things were with the standard video modes, effectively. If we go to this shot that's in even lower light, it looks like there's comparatively a lot of daylight left. I can tell you there wasn't. This was actually quite a dark scene. This was quite a dark area, much, much darker than it looks here. But as you can see, so much motion blur on the Action 5 Pro, just not great for the stabilisation at all. And then the Action 6 does a much better job. There is still some jitter going on, but I'd say that was a respectable job for the stabilisation on the Action 6, considering the low light levels. I'd say that was pretty good, despite the fact there was a little bit of jitter there. But as we found in the previous shots, again, it's a darker exposure on the Ace Pro 2, and I'm going to just go into that in a moment, but you can see the stabilisation there is way better than both of the DJI cameras. Now, why is the exposure lower? I think this is because the three cameras are handling things very, very differently. If we talk about the Action 6 versus the Ace Pro 2, because we can see the Action 5 is just not doing a good job at all when it comes to the stabilisation, even though it's in sports stabilisation mode. On the Ace Pro 2, it's set to the blur reduction mode, which again, it's supposed to prioritise the shutter speed at the expense of exposure so that you absolutely minimise motion blur and jitter, but mostly motion blur as a result of slow shutter. So it increases that shutter speed at the expense of exposure. The Action 6 Sport Stabilisation mode is supposed to do exactly the same thing, but it's a brighter exposure. And I can't say for sure why that is, but I have an idea that I think in terms of the philosophy of how this is approached, the DJI camera is going, you know what, I'm going to prioritize exposure. I know you want faster shutter speed for better stabilization, but I'm still not going to let you down with the exposure. I'm going to keep the exposure high, even if that means I'm going to introduce some motion blur at some point. Whereas the Ace Pro 2, I think, is going, well, you've told me to maximize the shutter speed. That's exactly what I'm going to do. And if you can't see anything as a result of that, well, then you shouldn't be shooting in such low light after all, then should you? So if we take this other shot, which I think kind of confirms this, just as an experiment, I tried this shot, which was in virtually no light at all. Again, I know you can see the sky there, and it looks like there is a bit, but I'm telling you, this was extremely low light. There was no light at all, pretty much. And if we look at the Action 6 playing back, you can see the exposure is up there, but there's a lot of motion blur introduced from the fact that the shutter speed just isn't fast enough for the stabilization to work properly. But if we contrast that with the Ace Pro 2, you can barely see anything, but you can see the stabilization is absolutely superb. So I think that kind of backs up my idea of where the philosophy in terms of the exposure goes. Whereas on the DJI Action 6, when you've set it to sport stabilization mode, it will still do its damnedest to give you a good exposure, even if that means introducing the motion blur. Whereas the Ace Pro 2 goes, I'm keeping the stabilization really good, even if you can't see anything much. But let's see if we can bring that up. I don't think I'll be able to. We can try the exposure option here. Yeah, you got a bit there. You got a bit of detail going on there, but it's not really usable, is it? I mean, no, it's not really usable. No. So I think in this case, it's a case of choosing your poison. You know, realistically, you're never really going to be shooting in this kind of low light level. I mean, you might have to do that at a pinch, but if you are going to do that, you cannot expect to have a good image. You can't. And it's your choice as to whether you forego the stabilization, maybe use a gimbal instead of relying on the electronic stabilization. A gimbal is always a good option to have for these little cameras in these sorts of situations, or you just have pitch blackness. But I think for certain on any of these action cameras, if you're going to go into that type of low light level, I think you're looking at getting a gimbal for the camera. But it just kind of shows a difference in philosophy between how the two cameras approach their motion blur reduction philosophy. I think there's two different priorities there. But anyway, as you can see, you know, the Ace Pro 2 generally does a better job of the stabilization all around, no matter what the light level. And again, if we look at the car approaching, going past, see at that point there, you can see the hard cutoff on the exposure on the Action 6. And then when you've got, you can still see the texture on the road. It's done a much better job of that. And once again as well, if we look at the street light, I think the Ace Pro 2 has handled that street light a lot better. Whereas the Action 6 kind of makes into, again, a hard cut-off. It's a bit of a blob. In this shaky movement scenario where I'm running along, the Action 6, again, does a much better job than the Action 5. The Action 5 held it together a bit better in this situation when I was on the more brightly lit street sequence. But once you got into this area where there was much less in the way of street lighting. I know these street lights look like they should be lighting everything up, but they are actually quite dim. They're quite spread out, and they're not lighting it up anywhere near as much as the previous street sequence. And, you know, you can see the Action 5 Pro stabilization falling apart, whereas for the most part, the Action 6 stabilization actually is doing a very good job, but the Ace Pro 2 stabilization system is doing an exceptional job. Certainly for low light at the moment, the Ace Pro 2 is looking like it handles things the best of all, depending on what your priority is. Now, in this extreme example, you could turn off the blur reduction option on the Ace Pro 2 and probably get a similar exposure to the Action 6. The same goes for this scenario as well here. But that's not to say the Action 6 is terrible. I think it is still doing a good job considering the light levels here. It's not terrible. by any stretch, comparatively speaking, but the Ace Pro 2 is clearly doing the more solid job of all these cameras in that situation. So we've looked at the low light modes on these cameras. How do these cameras fare in low light when it comes to the standard video recording? And what about things like noise reduction? So let's take a look at those aspects next. Okay, so there is a lot to go through here. You might have noticed that I also put in there some more experimentation with the night modes as well. And that's because I wanted to test some of the shutter speed restrictions or ranges that you can put on the DJI Action cameras. And this goes back to what I said in the previous segment where I suggested that the Ace Pro 2 prioritized the shutter speed over everything when you put it into the blur reduction mode. But on the flip side of the coin, the DJI cameras, despite putting them into the sport mode, which is supposed to do the same thing, i.e. restrict the shutter speed, it doesn't seem to do so to the same degree as the Ace Pro 2, which results in some more blurry stabilisation in low light modes. So on these first shots that you saw, you'll notice that I put the auto shutter at 1/24th to 1/8000th of a second, and that is the default range that these DJI Action cameras have. Now, what that means is that you're giving the camera the full option, the full range of shutter speeds. Now, if it goes down to 1/24th of a second because it thinks, oh my God, I'm in low light, I need to get a decent exposure, 1/24th will give you a better low light exposure, but it will also give you some pretty horrible stabilization. It just doesn't work for stabilization. It's pretty terrible. It's not really that usable unless the handheld look is what you want. I mean, that might be what you want in the end. But if you want good stabilization, then it's no good. And even here with the sports stabilization and the standard color profile, you can see it's still not really doing a very good job. Now, the Action 6, pretty similar when it has the full range of the shutter available to it. Even with that f2 lens, it's still going for a slower shutter rather than doing what the sport mode is supposed to do and keeping things as stable as possible by having as high shutter speed as possible. So yeah, if you leave the DJI cameras to their own devices, they do tend to use slower shutter speeds, resulting in a shakier stabilization in low light. If we contrast this again with the Ace Pro 2, you just put the stabilization on high, blur reduction on, and hey presto, you've got absolutely rock solid stabilization. This is an iLog with the manufacturer's LUT. Then this is a standard profile. And, you know, I left the cameras in their default settings when it comes to noise reduction. So that's 0 on the DJI Action cameras, and you don't have control over noise reduction on the Ace Pro 2. So the Ace Pro 2 does look grainier and noisier in these examples, but I'm not holding that against it. In its own way, it kind of looks a bit more naturalistic and a bit grittier. So that's not really a problem for me. And like I've said in previous videos, when I've set the DJI Action 6 down to -2 on the noise reduction, you can always use software to get rid of a lot of that noise and smooth things out if you want to. So once again, the Ace Pro 2 is doing a much better job here. And as we can see from this triple split in the log modes with the LUTs applied, yeah, okay, the Ace Pro 2 looks a bit grainier, so what? The Action 6 is definitely giving a lighter exposure, but the stabilization just isn't very good in any way, shape or form like this. So that kind of takes away from it. So yeah, if left to its own devices, the Ace Pro 2 still does a much better job in low light than the DJI cameras. Now, you might be asking why I did this test in both the log profiles and the standard profiles. And the reason for that is because on the DJI cameras, in the log mode, you have a limited ISO. So in log mode on the DJI cameras, the ISO maxes out at 12,800, whereas on the standard modes, it maxes out at 25,600. So that boost in ISO, I wanted to see if the camera would make a better choice in terms of the shutter speed and to see whether it would effectively give a more stabilized image. But that doesn't appear to be the case. the DJI cameras are still shaking around all over the place because I've given them the option of going down to 1/24th of a second. And I think, even though I've set it on sport stabilization, I think that's exactly what it's done. I wasn't monitoring this. You can, if you are looking at the screen and you're looking at the settings, you can see what shutter speed the camera is using at any given time. But when you're using it on the end of a selfie stick, you just can't see it, and it's not embedded in any metadata. It would be nice if it was embedded in the metadata so you could see this kind of stuff, but it isn't. So we don't know. My theory is, looking at all that shake though, it's most definitely gone down to that minimum shutter speed of 1/24th, despite the sport stabilization setting. Okay, so how can we improve things? We know that the Ace Pro does an amazing job straight out of the box when it comes to this low light stuff, but can we get the DJI cameras anywhere near the Ace Pro? And actually, yes, we can, sort of. So that's why I did this restricted shutter speed test. And what I did was I did two versions. I did one where I gave it a minimum shutter of 1/100th of a second, just to see what the stabilization would be like at that speed. And the other was I gave it a minimum of 1/200th of a second. So it had a choice between 1/200th of a second and 1/8000th of a second if it wanted to. I knew it was never going to go as high as that. But pretty much in these low light situations, the DJI cameras seem to choose the absolute minimum that they can get away with given your settings. So this works in super night mode and also in the standard color profiles and dlog M. So as you can see here, this is the Action 5 Pro, and it's doing a pretty nice job of the stabilization there by restricting that shutter speed. There's still just a tiny little bit of jitter going on in the background in these lights. Just the tiniest bit. But it's a big improvement. But as you can see, it's a fairly dim image, even in the super night mode. We go to 1/100th of a second, and we get a slightly brighter image, but yeah, that motion blur and jitter is back again. It's nowhere near as bad as it was, but it's still not desirable. If you're going to go for a handheld look, go all out for the handheld look. You don't need a half and half thing. So that's the Action 5 Pro. Now the Action 6 at 1/200th in super night mode. Again, a vast improvement over what it was. And there is some very minor jitter going on in lights in the background. It's very small, very tiny, generally imperceptible, but a massive improvement and very close to the Ace Pro 2. And again, at 1/100th, we're kind of introducing that jitter and motion blur again, although I don't think it's quite as bad as the Action 5 Pro. I think because the Action 6 can open up. I've got this set to the f2.0, so I think it is using a slightly faster shutter speed, maybe, don't know. But either way, it's kind of irrelevant. 1/200th of a second to 1/8000th of a second is what you want your DJI camera set to with sports stabilization if you want to ensure that you get the best stabilization in low light. In reality, I think if you set the auto shutter to that range of between 1/200th and 1/8000th, I think the sports stabilization might actually be irrelevant because you are literally forcing it to not go below 1/200th of a second no matter what. So the sports stabilization is probably irrelevant in this case, but I'll leave it to you to do some more experimentation for yourselves. And as we can see, we look at the Ace Pro 2, and this is just on auto. And again, it just does an amazing job. You just can't fault it really. And if we split screen this in 1/200th of a second, you can see the Action 6 has a slightly brighter exposure than the Ace Pro 2, ever so slightly. We play it through. It's very close in quality of stabilization to the Ace Pro. You do get that very tiny amount of flicker sometimes in lights in the background, even doing this with the Action 6, but that's definitely something that could be changed in a firmware. So I would recommend to DJI that when you put the Action 6 and the Action 5 Pro into sport stabilization mode, it should go to a minimum of 1/220th of a second. Not 1/200th, but 1/220th. That extra 20th of a second will just take the edge off those tiny little micro jitters that are still left there, and would bring it on par with the Ace Pro 2 in terms of that quality. I don't know why DJI hasn't done that already, because if you set the sport stabilization, it says it maximizes the shutter speed to ensure good stabilization, but it doesn't actually seem to be doing that in practice, particularly when it comes to low light situations. So I think sport mode should have a hard cutoff at 1/220th of a second, and not go below that, to ensure that you get solid stabilization in low light. And then if you want stabilization that's a bit freer, use daily stabilization. So that's my recommendation to DJI. But as you can see, you can get the Action 6 and the Action 5 pretty close to the Ace Pro 2 in terms of the quality of stabilization in low light. The Action 5 Pro, obviously, it can't expose quite as high as the others because it doesn't have as fast a lens. The Ace Pro 2, as I said in the previous video, is f2.6, so it is slightly faster than the Action 5 Pro, and I think it has a slightly better imaging processing pipeline. As I said earlier, it has a dedicated chip that's entirely dedicated to image processing, so it can do a better job overall, I think. It's just a shame that the Ace Pro doesn't have 10-bit color. So I've got more tests here in the log modes. So I've got the DJI Action 5 Pro in 1/100th of a second to 1/8000th. And as you can see, although it's some jitter is there, it's not absolutely terrible. You know, in a pinch you could use it, but it's much preferable to go to 1/200th. It's darker, yes, but as you can see, it's pretty rock solid stabilization there. I've just used the manufacturer's LUT here just for the sake of speed, really, because we're really looking at the quality of the stabilization overall. And as we can see here with the DJI Action 6 and dlog M 1/100th, very similar result, but as you can see, it's much brighter due to that f2 lens than the Action 5. Actually, I've forgotten to put the LUT on the Action 5. Let's put that on. That's better. Right, so that's a better comparison. So that's the Action 5. And that's the Action 6, and we'll have a look at those in the triple split in a moment. And then 1/200th of a second in dlog M on the Action 6. It was getting dark pretty quick here, so there is some variance in light. Nothing's ever perfect, is it? But yeah, you can see much better stabilization going on there. And again, the Ace Pro 2, grittier looking because of the higher grain on the default setting, but as I say, not holding that against it, it's quite a nice naturalistic look. You can see the textures there, and having that bit of grit in low light, it's not always a bad thing, is it? So yeah, here we have 1/100th on a triple split with the Ace Pro 2 on its default settings, because the Ace Pro 2, you don't really have that kind of control over things in the same way as the DJI cameras. So the Ace Pro 2 is just gone on full auto, and it's just doing its thing. But 1/100th, you can see you get a brighter exposure overall on the Action 6 thanks to the f2 lens. And again here, 1/200th. Now, in a pinch, I'd say the Action 6 was just slightly brighter. And you can see the noise reduction doing its thing there. One thing I've been finding with the Action 6 is that the default noise reduction, I think in general, actually does an exceptionally good job, and it does it while still keeping a lot of the texture there. So I'm kind of getting a bit torn now between using it on the default 0 setting and turning it down. I need to do some more experimentation with that, and I'll show you in a moment why I'm a little bit hesitant to reduce it at the moment. But as I say, I kind of like the way that the Ace Pro 2 has that grittiness. I think that the Action 6, when you reduce that noise reduction, I think the codec on the DJI cameras struggles more with the noise than the Insta360 does. I don't know if that's because of an overall higher bit rate. It's a bit useless looking at the stated bit rate of these things, because when compression systems work, they rarely go to that maximum bit rate that you have in the specification. It's not how it works. But I think maybe the Ace Pro 2 might be doing a bit of a better job, because I'm not seeing as many compression artifacts in the noise as you do with the DJI cameras. If we go up into the sky here, yeah, there's a bit of bittiness going on. If I play that through, yeah, I mean, you can see dot crawl going on, but it's, if I show you the DJI system here, so that's the Action 5. This is the Action 6 with the noise reduction set to -2. You can see already the macro blocking going on here. You see the way it changes. It's not a consistent noise pattern. It's noisy, but the compression system is really struggling. And here around these trees, you can see it's really having difficulty. And I think that, and this is the Action 5, if we compare that, let's say, with the Ace Pro 2, you can see it looks much more like a consistent noise pattern as you'd expect. And I've noticed that the file sizes on the Ace Pro 2 are consistently larger, no matter what lighting you're in, whether it's daylight or at night. The file sizes on the Ace Pro 2 are consistently almost double the size of the Action 6, even though the Ace Pro 2 is 8-bit and the Action 6 is 10-bit color. So that to me says that DJI's compression system, on the one hand, extremely efficient, but also at the same time, even though you might have it set to the high quality setting, it's still a relatively low bit rate potentially compared with what the Ace Pro is doing. So again, this is something I need to do some more testing and looking at to see if it's the case that overall the DJI cameras are recording at an overall lower average bit rate than the Ace Pro 2. But I think it stands to reason that it is, A, because of the file sizes that I'm seeing, and B, because of what we've just seen in the noise patterns. As a result of that, because I'm finding that the noise reduction in the Action 6 seems to be very efficient and good at reducing that noise in the image while not completely destroying all the textures. If I want that grittiness back, I can always add it back in to the DJI image. So I think one of the things that DJI, again, might need to look at is offering an ultra-high bitrate mode. And I mentioned this in my main review of the Action 6 at the time, and I think it's sort of borne out by what we're seeing here. And again, standard profile on the DJI Action 5 Pro at 200th of a second minimum, and you know, it's doing a good job, slightly dimmer than what you have on the Action 6 here. And obviously you have the Ace Pro as a reference point here. So let's look at the triple screen. So in standard video profile modes, Action 5 Pro is the dimmest, and it's actually pretty close between the Action 6 and the Ace Pro when I have 1/200th of a second set. So because the Ace Pro 2 has a slightly faster lens than the Action 5 Pro, that could explain the closeness of this. And there is just ever so slightly more brightness in the Action 6 image. It's almost imperceptible. So it seems to me that if you want a camera that is going to do what you need out of the box and you don't want to be messing around with the settings, if you're shooting in low light and indeed many other situations, then the Ace Pro 2 would appear to be the camera to go to. Whereas DJI, particularly the Action 6, you can get it imperceptibly close to the Ace Pro 2 in terms of the low light stabilisation. It's just that you have to go into that one setting. So it is ever so slightly more technical than the Ace Pro 2 in that regard. You do, of course, have a bit more control over those settings on the DJI than you do on the Ace Pro. But then again, in the night mode, the Ace Pro 2 does allow you to set the sharpness to low as well. So it's kind of half a dozen of one thing, half a dozen of another. Pick your poison, you know, which way do you want to go? You can have one or the other. Why can't we just have one action camera that does it all? But anyway, you know, this is what I'm seeing. All of these cameras seem to do very well, but certainly in low light, the Ace Pro 2 is the best performer, I think, overall. And I think that if DJI could increase that bit rate so that if you want to reduce the noise setting, you don't suffer from these compression artifacts. That's one reason why GoPro offers the Labs firmware option of being able to up the bit rate to a really high level, not just for general recording, but also because if you want to reduce the noise reduction setting on that camera, GoPro knew that in order to get the best out of that, you are going to have to bump up that maximum bit rate. So DJI should take note of this and give power users the option of an ultra high bit rate for those kinds of situations. The other thing I would say is that when you have a noise pattern that is interfered with by the compression system, i.e. you get that macro blocking, it makes it much harder for noise reduction software like Topaz and the stuff that's built into Resolve to actually deal with it, because it can't find a consistent noise pattern to hook onto to remove. So, you know, that's another reason why it's better to be able to have a higher bit rate if possible to try and mitigate that. But anyway, enough of that. That's my examination of these cameras in low light, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next video. And don't forget, if you did like this and you stuck to it to the end, please let me know in the comments, and please do leave me a like and subscribe if you can, and tell all your friends. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.